Hi everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Behold on the Genre Equality channel. I'm Hitzer,
I'm Isa.
and of course, welcome to our new listeners at Singapore Community Radio. Thanks for checking us out on Twitch or on the SGCR channel. If you want, also, you can listen back to the back archives of all of our episodes
Mm-hmm.
on our Mixcloud. If you're listening to the old episodes, you may notice a little audio low finess in our audio. That's because we didn't have mics back then. So do forgive us, but we have bought mics subsequently, and now we are recording via Zencaster due to COVID. So our audio quality is considerably improved, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm really enjoying the quality of our shows so far.
For sure. I mean, I think Zencaster has kind of been a godsend for what we're trying to do in times like this.
I know, man. If you guys aren't familiar with what Zencaster is, do go Google them. It's in my opinion the best way to record podcasts remotely. Way better than recording your Zoom conversations or your Google Hangouts or something. The audio quality is so much clearer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we are not like sponsored by Zencaster or anything,
Yeah.
but we are using them so often and for free. Keep in mind it's free. That like I felt like I should give them a shout out. Zencaster is the best, man.
For sure, for sure. I mean, I don't think we would have it wouldn't have been as easygoing. I think if we haven't found Zencaster.
Definitely, yeah. The editing would have been a lot more tedious and stuff like that. So
Mm.
yeah, check out Zencaster if you're a podcaster yourself or you wanna start a podcast. Anyway, this is the Behold podcast on the Genre Equality channel. If you don't know what genre equality is, we started out as a podcast slash channel covering all sorts of genre things. Um, Supernatural stuff, superhero stuff, horror, sci-fi, fantasy, anything that or animation even that can be folded into the broad term that is genre, basically, which is fantasy filmmaking or narratives.
Mm-hmm.
For Behold, we decided to start this particular podcast because there were other things we wanted to talk about beyond the realms of the fantasy and sci-fi and superheroes and all of that.
Yep.
But for this episode of Behold, considering that it is what people like to call spooky season, since it is the Halloween month, the month
Mm-hmm.
of Halloween. Halloween's on October 31st, but generally around the world, people take October as an excuse to watch horror films, to just to dress up and things like that. I don't think there will be any trick or treating this year, because of the world.
Yeah.
But we can still watch and talk about horror filmmaking. And because we talk about horror so much on genre equality, we thought we'll take a little different spin on horror in this particular episode of Behold by talking about meta horror. Meta horror is horror films about horror films. These are films that either deconstruct and dissect the tropes of horror filmmaking
Mm-hmm.
or celebrate the tropes of horror filmmaking, and in most of these instances they do both of them at the same time. They livingly parody them, but they're also sweet valentines to the beauty of horror filmmaking. And I think you find that in all four of the titles that we're talking about, you'll find that in common. We'll be talking about what I consider to be the best meta horror of all time. That will be our main topic.
Mm.
Drew Goddard's The Cabin in the Woods. Secondly, we'll be talking about what I feel is to be the second best meta horror film of all time. Coming out from Japan, it is a full mockumentary. It is one cut of the dead about a documentary film crew shooting. Well, no, well, it's about
No.
a
Yeah.
film crew shooting a zombie film that attacked by real zombies. And then there's a twist later. Will reveal that as we talk about it. And then we gotta talk about the granddaddy, the
Mm-hmm.
godfather of meta horror, without which none of the modern meta horror would ever exist. Wes Craven basically introduced the concept with Nightmare on Elm Street 7, aka New Nightmare, which is about the crew of the Freddy Krueger films being haunted by Freddy Krueger himself. And then subsequently, he polished up his idea and made Scream, which is the most iconic, I think, or at least the most famous
Yeah.
meta horror film of all time, which very funnily broke down the rules of horror filmmaking, uh, while kind of lampooning it at the same time. But let's begin with the best one,
Yeah.
and my favorite of all time. It is The Cabin in the Woods, written by Buffy writers Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard, directed by Drew Goddard, who you may know from The Martian, from Cloverfield, and the showrunner of Daredevil season one. He's done a bunch of things. He wrote on Lost as well. But I think like this is Drew Goddard's signature piece.
Hmm.
It is a 2011 American horror comedy, and it stars Kristen Connolly, Chris Hemsworth, way before he became Thor, Anna Hutchinson, Fran Kranz, Richard Jenkins, and Bradley Whitford in hilarious roles. The plot follows a group of college students who retreat to a remote forest cabin where they fall victim to backwoods zombies, while technicians in the background manipulate events from an underground facility. And if you kind of saw the initial marketing for The Cabin in the Woods, the posters, the trailers, and you were not interested in watching it, I totally understand you.
Hmm.
This movie positions itself as the most generic horror movie of all time for good purpose. It starts out generic and then it starts to subvert its own tropes, and then it peels back layers of what audiences expect from horror filmmaking
Hmm.
to make us complicit in what we want to watch and the horrors that we are watching via the technicians involved. Um, I mean, let's bring it back, because The Cabin in the Woods wasn't a very successful release
Yeah.
for the reasons I mentioned. The Cabin in the Woods was actually filmed in 2009, was supposed to be released in 2009. It got delayed to 2010, then it got delayed to 2011. So it was a 2 year delay. Um, Primarily because I think they thought they couldn't market the film without giving away the twist, which
Yeah.
is a unique conundrum. When you first saw trailers or posters or whatever for Cabin in the Woods, like, were you intrigued at first?
Yeah, I think I didn't watch Cabin in the Woods when it first came out, right? Like it was
Oh,
only
okay.
way after the initial theatrical run that
Hmm.
it was recommended to me, right? Because I bought into the whole fact, oh my god, no, this is gonna be just another run of the mill kind of like horror thing,
Yeah, even the
right?
title, is so run of the mill.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I understand completely, like it is a very unique problem to have, I
Hmm.
feel. And I was totally the way that they marketed it, the way that the trailers were set up and all of that, like really did not appeal to me. And it was only much later, after people took a chance with it and recommended it to me, that
Hmm.
I went ahead and watched that. And I'm thankful that I did, because like what a small joy, like really, just to discover something of this caliber,
Hmm.
kind of like a hidden gem for people who just love horror in general. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, for me, I wouldn't even have given it a chance if I didn't know who wrote and directed it.
Mm.
You all know, like, my basis for all loving pop culture is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It is my ground zero for genre things. And Joss Whedon, the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, renowned actually for his subversive take on genre,
Hmm.
is the writer of this. And my favorite writer on Buffy and Angel, Drew Goddard, was the one who co-wrote this and directed it as well. So I found it, just based on name value alone. I know like Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard aren't like Steven Spielberg or whatever, so they're not gonna draw the casual audience, but they drew
Yeah.
me lah, and Buffy fans, which aren't that many, and Firefly fans and things like that. So I knew I was gonna love it, and I knew there was something different about it even before I watched it, just because I know what it is lah, and
Hmm.
and, and what the writers are capable of. So like for fans of horror films, I think Drew and Joss sort of wrote this as a quote unquote loving slash hate letter to the genre. The movie serves as both a send up to classic horror and also a criticism of what horror has become. Like the kind of torture porn that the genre has become popular with. With titles like Saw and Hostel and Human Centipede and things like this.
Yep.
Um, so I think that the best way to describe The Cabin in the Woods is that it is a meta horror movie attempting to revitalize the genre by taking all aspects of it apart.
Hmm.
But unlike Scream, which is a horror slasher movie with some self awareness, um, Cabin is a full-on deconstruction of the horror genre in all its forms.
Yeah.
It uses tired tropes in order to highlight how tired they are, but also on some level creatively defends their use by offering a clever explanation for why those tropes exist in
Uh-huh.
universe.
Yep.
Kind of retroactively explaining every single horror movie from every country, like why the tropes exist in Japanese horror, why the tropes exist in American horror,
Yeah.
etc. Unfortunately, that's about as much as I can say about the film without giving it away. And I know a lot of people haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, so I mean, part of this is I want you to go watch it. So I don't want to give away what the details of it, like, other than to say that. But by even saying it's a meta horror film, I'm already giving it away. So
Yeah.
but I need to hook you with that. But otherwise, we're gonna be talking a bit more broadly about The Cabin in the Woods, so what about you guys? So what do you think about Cabin in the Woods after you got over the initial I'm not interested in this, your friends recommended it, and then you went to watch it? Did it blow your mind, or were you surprised by what you saw?
I think okay, so they don't wait very long within the movie itself to start subverting stuff, right?
Hmm.
I think almost immediately, if we look at the kind of the opening sequence and how that jumps straight away into a very kind of light-hearted discussion, in the first scene,
Yeah.
and the kind of bantering that goes on there, like they straight away it sets the tone that look, okay, you thought with how the opening sequence works, this is how it's gonna be, right? But immediately it cuts into something like totally unexpected, and that sets the tone,
Hmm.
and that definitely helped moving forward with
Yeah.
the film itself, right? And they slowly build it from there, and it feels as though that you have already been uh, primed to have a bit of distance from what's actually happening on screen,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're aware that it's not just but meets the eye and so on and so forth. Of course, the actual mystery of it is very slowly unveiled in very clever ways, I must say, and because of that, you're slowly kind of let in. But I think from the get go, they do establish the fact that this isn't a run of the mill horror film, right? Like they're going to
Hmm.
run through all the beats and they do so extremely well. But they're not going to, just run through the beats and deliver just those beats itself, right? They've established from the beginning that this is going to be slightly different. If you start to pay attention, you start to realize certain things, and hope you enjoy the ride. So
Yeah.
that's pretty much what I felt my first experience of it was.
Hmm.
I think upon I just recently rewatched it just to refresh it for the podcast.
Nice.
Um, it really is very tight in terms of the way that they pull everything together, and
Hmm.
there is just enough like question marks surrounding some of the possible details that they could have filled you in with, right? But they don't.
Yeah.
That kind of like adds to the mystery of it on like a totally different level outside of unpiecing what's happening
Hmm.
to the actors and all of that, and what's going on in the greater storyline. So yeah, I totally love what they've done. I think like watching it, it has great rewatch value, despite the
Hmm.
fact that you've already watched it once and you know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, it's
This
not relying on a twist, right?
Yeah, it's not reliant on twist at all. In fact, knowing the twist makes you notice more things, and it's one
Hmm.
of those films, right? That I think no matter how many times you watch it, it brings something more to the table, and that's just testament to the kind of quality that we have. I
Yeah,
do feel that the what I would enjoy the most is showing the film to people who haven't watched it before.
definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I feel like the Cabin in the Woods is more than like an exercise in self awareness, or it's more than like Scary Movie, which is a spoof lah.
yeah,
It's a wickedly smart hybrid mutation, and it's an exercise in metafiction that, while providing grisly fun, never distances the viewers. It is entertaining while asking the same question of the viewers and the characters alike.
yeah,
Why do you come to a place you knew all along that was going to be so dark and dangerous? It kind of makes horror audiences complicit in what they're watching. You know what you're going to get, you know what the beats are, you know what the tropes are. Why
yeah,
are you watching this? And the characters themselves, once they realize what's happening to them, um bite back at the horror audience. In this case, like our horror audience proxies of the technicians in the secret underground lab,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Like, why are you doing this to us? It's fantastic. Like, it's a fantastic poke in the eye for our horror movie expectations, and it subverted expectations that accompany the genre to such a great effect, and it's a self-conscious twist on one of the ugliest stepchildren of the horror genre, like
Hmm.
the co-ed campsite massacre, which is what the Cabin in the Woods implies. It's
Yeah.
Drew Goddard is brilliant. I mean, I've to be honest, like, a lot of the elements in the film I have seen in Buffy. Like, they kind of recycled some element most of the film from plots in Buffy into, obviously a different concept lah.
Yeah.
And I didn't mind that, because I know a lot of people don't watch Buffy, and if this encourages you to dig into what else Joss Whedon has done and what Drew Goddard has done, I mean, primarily this is Drew Goddard's film lah. Then yeah, you should definitely check out everything that these two have done.
Hmm.
Love the cliches that form the backbone of the film's humor and creativity, but also love the way that the cliches are defended. As I said, it's a loving letter and a hate letter. It's a
Yeah.
Valentine and deconstruction. Yeah, it's a place to worship when the gods of horror.
Yeah. For sure. For
Mhm.
sure. For sure. I Oh man, I wish we could talk a bit more about like going into the whole thing, but I think we should just keep it spoiler free enough for people to be keen to watch it, because that's after all what we're recommending.
Yeah, I definitely agree, man. I'm a little sad that this film, I mean, it's critically acclaimed. Like, literally every critic who watched it ended up loving it, lah. But it is a tough sell. Like, every review I read back in the day just couldn't explain what makes it
Yeah.
special. It's so difficult to sell the film. The Sixth Sense could be sold without the twist.
Yeah.
But this couldn't.
Yeah.
Um, Fantastic stuff.
What do you think about the kind of commitment to that, right? Like the fact that they didn't spoil anything, they didn't give away the whole premise because like it will ultimately spoil the movie, as opposed to the kind of trailers we get today where the entire movie basically gets contained within the trailers itself, right? Even for horror.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I respect the restraint in marketing. I respect the adherence to, obviously, Joss and Drew did not want their movie to be given away, lah. So the marketing was as generic as you could make it. But at the same time, also, it's an art versus commerce conundrum, lah. Like, how are you going to sell this movie? What makes it fun? What
Yeah.
makes it special? Audiences are not going to know that watching the marketing material. I think the movie has taken on a life of its own since then through word of mouth. As you were saying, this is how you got into the film, right?
Yeah.
So the word of mouth, the DVD sales, the streaming numbers have been very good, especially during Halloween time, when people are looking for something deeper and something a little less cliche to watch for horror.
Hmm.
It's a very good film for wised up viewers, those who know the classic horror tropes and stuff like that. It's a bit like the perfect movie for horror hipsters.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think most recently, a film called Split hit its twist very well during marketing.
Yep. Yep.
But again, like, Split could be sold without the connection to the M Night Shyamalan verse, I guess. Which in itself is a spoiler. I'm sorry if you haven't watched Split or Glass, but I'm sure you all know by now. Like, it's connected to Unbreakable. So yeah, sorry about
Ye-
that.
No, I think it's okay. I don't think too many. Yeah, it's
Because
fine.
the marketing for Glass, like, pretty much gave away the twist to Split lah. So I mean, yeah lah.
Yeah,
I don't think I give away anything there.
yeah. I don't think it's an issue for sure. But
Yeah.
but Split is definitely one of the rarities, right? Like time and
Mhm.
time again, like we get spoiled by the trailers, and you got to kind of ask yourself, um, it's again art versus commerce, as you so plainly put it.
Mhm.
But oh man, I sometimes like these days I really just completely avoid trailers if it's something I really want to watch and I'm
Mhm.
excited about. I tend to just like skip trailers altogether because they don't increase my excitement. And
Mm.
I tend to be okay if I'm late to watching something and people are talking about spoilers. Like I still want to see it for myself, so it isn't so much of a problem. I'm relatively I'm not as wary of spoilers per se, but there's something about the trailer spoiling the movie for me that just is kind of irksome, you know.
Yeah, man, 100% agree on that. So like it's a blessing and a curse, lah. The Cabin in the Woods is marketing ploy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think in the end, once you have seen a film, and I am telling you that this film is really really good. Like, forget the generic setup. It is supposed to be as generic as possible. That
Yep.
is the point,
Yep.
you know. What I can say is that it is a fiendishly clever brand of meta level genius. You know, it is a pulpy an insightful send up of horror films that just elicits as many chuckles as it does gasps. It comes to not only praise uh, and disqualify the slasher, zombie and gore fest of yore, but critique them as well.
Hmm.
Constructive criticism, I might add, elaborating on their elements and archetypical figures, even while searching for a way to put them to novel use. I suppose the danger of such a lofty, ironic approach is that everything in the film appears with ready-made quotation marks around it.
Yeah.
But by then the audiences will have picked up on the infectiously goofy vibe. Because more than just being an intellectual exercise, it's also goofy fun. It's a great enterprise that is very sprightly. It doesn't take itself too seriously,
Hmm.
but at the same time has some very smart things to say about the genre lah. Like Cabin in the Woods came for me at a time when horror was at its lowest. If I'm to be honest, as a horror fan growing up, I watched the old classic monster movies from the 30s, the cheese from the 50s, the slashers from the 80s, things like that.
Hmm.
Horror and at the beginning of the 2000s and the late 90s was at the saddest, most despicable, most like exploitative point that I've ever seen in genre. Like it made me embarrassed to be a horror fan. Obviously recently with the new quote unquote prestige horror or
Yeah.
of A24, the Witch and Get Out and the Midsommar and Hereditary, the Babadook, It Follows, and things like that, right? Like horror has rejuvenated like with smarts.
Yeah.
But that was only recently. These movies are only within the last 5 to 6 years. When the Cabin in the Woods came out, right, I felt once again proud to be a horror fan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, did you think that horror was going down a very like lazy route, in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s before this film came along?
I'm I okay. I can't really recall just how many horror films I watched during that period. If
Mm-hmm,
anything, I feel like I barely watched any horror.
mm-hmm.
Just because I felt like everything just came out of a factory, right? Like everything is the
Yeah.
same beat and everything is so and so, which is probably why I didn't watch Cabin in the Woods when it came out, right?
Mm.
At past a certain point, I think like you maybe have three stories out there during that period of time, and they just rehashed to no end, right? You either
Mhm.
got it's a monster thing, it's a demon thing, it's a slash supernatural thing, or and
Possession.
yeah, possession, and then you have your kind of like slasher thing, right? And
Mhm.
just those just get recycled and recycled, like same beats, just different actors, maybe slightly different settings, nothing clever about it.
Mhm.
And they wanted to appeal to what they thought was the big demographic at that point in time, what would make them the most money. So when
Yeah.
Kevin and Woods comes along and they market it along the exact same lines, right? uh I'm just not interested because I've
Mhm.
at that point in time I thought I had seen it all.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, like we are living in a kind of horror renaissance right now, right?
Mhm.
Just with everything that's going on, with Haunting of Blind Manor just coming out as well,
Mhm. Mhm.
on Netflix to coincide with this whole Halloween period. Like, there's so much good stuff going on in horror. It's just like insane, how rejuvenated it's become,
Mhm.
and I think it's easy for us to kind of trace it back to what Cabin in the Woods has established, right? Like in a
Mhm.
time like that when
Mhm.
everything was just kind of meh, as things often tend to become after a while. um it took a bold step. They didn't do well at the box office, but
Mhm.
they did it for, I guess, a longer term,
Mhm.
some longer term ambitions, and I think it's paid off.
Yeah, man. Like, at the same time, it did stay on the shelf for a couple of years, but releasing it the same year that Thor was released was very smart.
Mm.
Because Chris Hemsworth wasn't a name in 2009. Chris Hemsworth was a name in 2011 lah. So
Yeah.
they got a big star out of it lah. But yeah, at the same time, I do see horror as pre Cabin in the Woods and post Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the Woods was the definitive full stop to all the cliches and the tropes that we've seen prior to 2011. Like this was the end game. There's nowhere that you can take these things anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the films that come after this have to realize. Have to do something else. You
Yeah.
can't do all these tired things anymore. The Cabin in the Woods has already deconstructed it. They showed you why it's smart, why it's not, why it's exploitative, why it's fun. All the different archetypes. So I think the arte horror films of today was really kind of galvanized by the Cabin in the Woods.
Mm.
By that this film said like enough.
Yeah.
Enough of this type of things. Let's move on lah. And to that effect, I think it really did lah. Well, one of the things that of horror films today have realized that horror doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean scary.
Yeah.
Like there are different kinds of horror: existential horror, familial horror, things that Hereditary and Haunting of Hill House are playing. If you look at one of the earliest horror stories ever told, Frankenstein, right?
Yeah.
Frankenstein by Mary Shelley isn't scary in the way that we think that horror movies have trained us to think that horror stories have to be scary, like horror
Yeah.
movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like Frankenstein was about a larger social message, about outsiders, right?
Mhm.
The horror of being the outsider, the horror of oppression, the horror of xenophobia, things like that. So I think like the current crop of horror movies aren't actually doing anything different. They're just harkening back to what made horror special in the first place.
Yeah. Right. I mean, like it's it's the difference between like focusing on a series of jump scares, right? No matter how clever they may possibly be that we got back then, because everything was about the jump scare, to a much deeper, a much more base horror that we all kind of live in
Mm,
perpetually, right? And kind of letting those things kind of bubble to the surface on the screen, right?
yeah.
So the horror lives a lot less within that few moments where something pops out on the screen, but it's
Hmm.
a much more, it's a much deeper kind of dread, right? That
Yeah.
they're pulling from, and
Yeah.
I think it's an important. I think like horror like that makes us kind of reflect and examine upon our own lives and the things that we kind of take for granted,
Hmm.
in our day to day, right?
Yeah.
And there's a type of catharsis there that is much more satisfying and much more pleasurable than what you get from your run of the mill 90s horror flick.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like 90s horror flicks, or to a certain extent, late 80s horror flicks. Like yeah, there are some gems in there. The Halloween one,
Yeah.
Freddy Krueger one, Nightmare on Elm Street one. The problem was like Nightmare on Elm Street, like 4 and 5, and Halloween 4 and 5, and Jason versus Freddy and things like that. That's when it started becoming a parody of himself
Yeah.
without actually becoming a parody of himself lah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, Cabin in the Woods, super highly recommended. A great full stop to an era of terrible horror. That exposes it, but at the same time, it's kind of a love letter to it as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, do check out the Cabin in the Woods. It's available, on all sorts of VOD platforms, on iTunes, on Amazon. If you have Hulu, you can stream it on Hulu as well. Yeah, I mean, great film by Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard, and of course, like if you love this, go check out Drew Goddard's other stuff. Go check out Joss Whedon's other stuff besides the Justice League,
Yeah.
which I still say to this day it's not his fault. He was given 3 months to redo that film. I mean, what you gonna do, right?
Well, what they're gonna do is a Snyder cut, apparently.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what's happening next year. But yeah, I think Joss Whedon ate a shit ton of crap for that, which I don't think he deserved lah.
Yeah.
He took on a last minute job and tried to salvage something unsalvageable. Anyways, we're moving on to what I consider to be like the modern era's best meta horror example. It
Mm.
is directed and written by Shinichirô Ueda. It's called One Cut of the Dead. Although the Japanese translation of the title actually means "Don't Stop the Camera," which it's actually quite funny if you watch the film. It is a 2017 Japanese zombie comedy film. It was released in Singapore in 2018. I caught it at a Japanese film fest at man, I forgot where I caught it. Probably the projector, right? It has to be.
Yeah.
Um, and it is made on amazingly the low budget of 3 million yen, which is only 25,000 US dollars. That is nothing, man.
Yeah.
With a cast of unknown actors, the film opened in Japan and found international box office success. For a budget of 3 million yen, it ended up grossing 28 million yen in total. 3.12 billion yen in
Yeah.
total,
Yeah.
and 28 million US dollars overall. Universal acclaim from critics, commercial acclaim, and man, this movie really deserves it. It follows um, the cast and crew of a low budget zombie film called One Cut of the Dead, and they're shooting at an abandoned water filtration plant. The director, inside the film, not the director of the film, the director in the film, Higurashi, argues with actors. And eventually abandons them. Suddenly, a real zombie apocalypse happens, and then begins to the delight of Higurashi, who insists that the camera operator must continue filming because this is gold. We have to capture this for our film.
Yeah.
And with this movie, I'm okay with giving away the twist because um it's not dependent on the twist.
Yeah.
You enjoy it
Yeah.
whether you know it or not. So it begins with a film crew shooting a zombie apocalypse. The zombie apocalypse happens. Suddenly, that's the first half of the film, which amazingly takes place in a 37-minute one take sequence that is just hilarious.
Yeah.
The second part of the film is about a faux documentary. So they were planning to shoot this. So it's about a film. They're shooting a film about a zombie apocalypse that attacks a real film crew. So it's a film within a film within a
The
film.
film. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the second part of it is more about the bureaucracy of filmmaking, how they're getting funding, the casting, the ineptitude of certain actors, and things like that. What I really loved about One Cut of the Dead is that, number one, it does this thing that I very rarely see in comedy, which I call the reverse punchline. The first act of the film, the 37-minute incredible one take sequence, right, gives you punchlines for setups that would later be delivered.
Yeah.
So it gives you like the end of the joke, and then you get the beginning of the joke towards the end of the film. It's really brilliant. It's a great way, such a different way to set up jokes. The guy who was squatting in the corner, right? You don't know
Yeah.
why he was doing that. Turns out he's a drunk and everything. Secondly, also, it's such a great celebration of DIY filmmaking. It,
Absolutely.
it, it's such a beautiful a beautiful look at people coming together, independent filmmakers coming together, or independent artists. Like, that doesn't necessarily need to be about filmmaking. Independent artists coming together and creating art. The art doesn't necessarily need to be genius. The art doesn't necessarily need to be good, but the art does mean something to these people. They put so much of their heart and soul and effort into it,
Yeah.
and a lot of the joy of art is in the process of creating the art. And One Cut of the Dead is really such a beautiful love letter to independent filmmaking as well, DIY
Mm-hmm.
filmmaking. Such an infectious fun, and kind of virtuosic in terms of its filmmaking as well, on such a low budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like to if you stay to the end of the credits, you get to see a film crew behind a film crew behind a film crew trying to hide each other.
Yeah.
Those are three film crews, right? And then of course the making of film crew who are behind the third film crew. So it's mind blowing, like in terms of the choreography and the setup and everything. But also just in terms of comedic beats. It's such a delight. It's one of the best comedies I've seen in the last 5 years. Also, I think
Mhm.
it's something that directors like Joss Whedon and Edgar Wright would really love.
Yeah.
But just done on an ultra low budget. What do you think about One Cut of the Dead, which I think you only saw recently?
Yeah. Yeah. I remember you invited me to watch it on the release, right? So you
Mm,
caught it at the film festival and you told me to watch it, but I only watched it recently.
yeah.
Wow. Wow. I mean, like, it is. I was sold by the premise, right? Which you were
Hmm.
already extremely excited to share about.
Yeah.
But to see it happen is oh man, it is so good. It is so clever, and it pulls on my all sorts of like kind of heartstrings, right? Having been involved in some certain forms of filmmaking, DIY kind of like music
Co-
video stuff and like school film stuff and all of that. Like, you have so many of those things that are identifiable, and you can kind of relate to in that, but just
mhm.
the way in which everything unfolds is so brilliant. right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the first 37 minutes and everything that happens there, like it has all the hallmarks of kind of like indie low budget filmmaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it feels clumsy, things are drag on for a bit too long and all of that, but every single one of those things have an explanation,
Yeah.
right? And every single one of those things has an explanation that you are probably not expecting.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
way it could just continually keeps resolving itself as they reveal what's going on
Mm-hmm.
is brilliant. It's so brilliant, right? And it feels like a lot of the times when you get happy accidents on set, right? Like for example, the camera accidentally kept rolling and you managed to get something really great,
Yeah.
right? And it feels as though the second part of the movie feels as though you are getting a peek into that kind of like uh the surprise and just kind of like the overall like elation that comes from having happy accidents,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't think I've ever seen in any other movie, right? Even movies about making movies don't hit this kind of like notes
Mm. Yes.
consistently, at least, right? But man, One Cut of the Dead, like every time there's something that you think you notice that's like, oh, okay, it's small budget, not enough, a single take, it can't be helped.
Yeah.
They they find a way to explain it. They find a way to add some sort of comic relief to it, and it's so good, it's so satisfying to watch.
Yeah, yeah. The reverse engineering of so many of its best gags, such unusual comedy setup, delivering the punchline first and then giving the setup later. It's amazing. Like and as you mentioned, like, it sparkles with the infectious. Come on, everyone, let's put on a show. Enthusiasm. That has served movies well. There are a lot of movies about making movies. There are a lot of horror movies about making horror.
Hmm.
There's a lot of zombie movies, and I think on all three levels, on all the let's put on a show movies, let's of meta horror,
Yep.
and just as a plain zombie film, I think it elevates the all three genres. With its delight, with its fun, with its smarts, with its beautiful gags.
Mm.
It's I mean, it's kind of a contrived film, but it's easy to forgive the contrivances
Yep.
because of its genius, and how funny it is.
Yeah.
Like seemingly unimportant details in the film's beginning and sluggish middle section, kind of blossom into killer jokes, like just 30 minutes later.
Yeah. Yeah.
What a great movie! And if you haven't seen it, please do go watch it. Like it's one of the best meta horror films I personally have ever seen, and just one of the best movies about making movies I've ever seen. Period. Lah.
Yep. I agree. I totally agree.
Yeah, man. Any concluding thoughts before we move on from One Cut of the Dead?
Oh, no, no. I think that's more than enough, right? To kind of get people to pay attention to this, because I
Yeah.
mean, like, there's so many small things, and we could go on and on about like every little thing and the way that the characters are developed and how they fit the archetypal, roles as both characters and as actors as well, and it's quite crazy, how it's done. Maybe we should shout out the short film that they did as well.
Yes, One Cut of the Dead. During the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the creators and crew of One Cut of the Dead, led by Shinichiro Ueda, released a quasi sequel to One Cut of the Dead called One Cut of the Dead Mission Remote. It features the return of the fictional cast and crew of this independent film company. They are tasked with making not a zombie film this time. They are tasked with making a pilot for a true crime documentary series.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of those on Netflix, for example, that type of thing. So they're trying to film a pilot for a true crime documentary. They got the budget, they got everything lined up. Suddenly COVID hits. So the producers are telling them, you gotta make the pilot still, you got a deadline, but you got to make the pilot over Zoom. So they're doing it remotely, lah.
Yeah.
And during that period, there was a flourish of quarantine produced short films, like Zoom call ensembles of sitcoms and stuff like that, like Parks and Rec and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Nothing, I think, was more creative than One Cut of the Dead's take on Zoom filmmaking.
Yeah.
Like in the infancy of the genre, where all different types of shows were making episodes via Zoom, One Cut of the Dead already parodied it,
Yeah.
like in the
Yeah.
beginning.
It's so brilliant. Yeah. I mean, like, it's crazy how just clever it is, right? Like, I
Mm.
just I mean, okay, so I watched the movie and then I went and watched the short film, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, how do you come up with some of these things, right? For you to
Mm-hmm.
look at something so recent, so
Yeah.
astutely, right, and break it down and make something out of it. It's just a joy, really. It is.
Yeah, I mean, you look at when this short film came out in April, right?
Yep.
I mean, COVID didn't really hit until March,
Yeah.
and like in a month, they already foresaw that this was going to be a thing,
Yep.
and they were already ready to parody it, One Cut of the Dead style. But still, at the same time, like it's not just mocking the fact that this is the only way to do films and mocking the limitations of it, but it's also once again a love letter to creativity via limitations.
Yeah.
Like you don't have money, you don't have resources, you don't have locations. We can still make art. Let's not limit ourselves to all these things. Like art can be made. Sure, it's cheesy, it may be bad, maybe it's not good, but that shouldn't stop you from trying to make art. And that's what I love about the One Cut of the Dead quote unquote franchise,
Yeah.
where they can still um mock all these things while at the same time celebrating it, and encouraging filmmakers to do what they do.
Yeah, for sure. Highly recommend One Kind of Dead as well as the companion short film that you can find on YouTube.
Yeah, it's called Mission Remote. You can find it on YouTube, and One Half of the Dead is available on all sorts of streaming services. You can probably a lot of you have Amazon Prime, so you can probably get it there. Yeah, so that was One Half of the Dead. I think the final two films have to be like talked about together.
Hmm.
It's really interesting because I was talking about, like, in the 80s and the 90s, right? The dearth of quality horror.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems to me that Wes Craven was feeling a little bored himself with what horror had become,
Yeah.
or what his over has become as well. And so in the year 19, man, what year was it?
96
1990,
or 94.
1994.
Yeah.
Yeah, was Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So if you stop following the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, I don't blame you. There were a lot of them, of course, the Nightmare on Elm Street one classic, the debut of Freddy Krueger, probably one of the best supernatural horror films of all time.
Yeah.
And then it suddenly kind of became. Uh, it started to recycle itself as a lot of franchises do. Like number two, number three. I suppose number four was not bad, but then number five and then number six. I particularly love four, which was Dream Warriors, lah.
Yeah.
But then Wes Craven, who hasn't directed Nightmare on Elm Street since the first film, came back for Nightmare on Elm Street 7, and he came up with a radical premise, especially for its time. Keep in
Hmm.
mind, this was 1994, and he came up with the idea that what if the crew of the original Nightmare on Elm Street, was haunted by Freddy Krueger? What if Wes Craven was a character in the film, and he was only making the Nightmare on Elm Street films to basically satisfy this demonic entity of Freddy Krueger? And
Yeah.
the second he stops making them, Freddy Krueger starts coming to life. So he has to keep making Nightmare on Elm Street films. And this movie brought back the original cast uh, from the first film. Specifically, Heather Langenkamp
Yeah.
reprises her role as Nancy Thompson. Of course, Freddy Krueger himself, what's his name, Robert Englund,
Hmm.
portrayed Robert Englund, the actor, and also portrayed Freddy Krueger himself again. This was the beginning of Wes Craven's meta horror phase, and he was trying something new here. And keep in mind, this was the mid '90s, early '90s,
Yep.
and stuff like this was just being done, was not being done, at all. Like this type of meta horror is so new that, yeah, I mean, this is not a perfect film. There were a lot of missteps. There are some boring moments to it as well.
Hmm.
But I do have to talk about Wes Craven's New Nightmare, because I think any discussion of meta horror has to pay tribute to like the OG of it, like, which is this film.
Yeah.
This meta horror take on Nightmare on Elm Street, which is so radical. You have not seen New Nightmare until quite recently, right?
Yeah. So I've seen the original,
Mm,
and then I've seen Dream Warriors,
yeah,
but that was it, right? Like New Nightmare, completely had absolutely no idea it existed.
yeah.
And of course, I think it came out at a time where, yeah, just basically, it wasn't on my radar.
Mm-hmm,
So to put it in kind of context, right, with everything else. So I watched New Nightmare recently, together with
Mm-hmm.
all other movies that we've been talking about
Yeah.
for this particular episode. So it's been a meta horror binge for me,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps me to see how seminal New Nightmare was in its
Mm-hmm.
time. Because like without someone taking the first step, without Wes Craven taking the first step and saying, hey, you know what? We need we need more horror movies in our horror movies,
Mm-hmm.
right? And without him kind of doing that, we don't get Cabin in the Woods, we don't get Scream, we don't get
Yeah.
Cabin in the Woods, we don't get One Cut of the Dead, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't think you as great as Cabin of the Woods is, as great as
Yeah.
One Cut of the Dead is, if New Nightmare didn't exist, I
Yeah.
don't think they would have been able to make those movies,
Mm.
right? Because it would have changed horror as we know it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't doubt that after a period of time, an aspiring author, an ambitious author would come along and say, like, you know what, we're done with this. Let's go and do something else. It could have been Cabin in the Woods, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think Wes Craven got there first, and
Yeah.
it is important for that reason. I definitely don't think it's a perfect movie for sure.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, if anything, I think Scream has so much more polish.
Yeah.
But it also means that some of the ideas that he started to explore in New Nightmare get left behind. Because
Mm-hmm.
with Scream, he decided to stick to a particular direction,
Mm-hmm.
which became what it became like in all its incarnations after that.
Yep.
But yeah, so I only got it recently, and I think with what I've been watching,
Mm-hmm.
it definitely makes sense. Like you can't take away from the fact that like New Nightmare established meta horror for what we know and kind of love today. I think.
Yeah, New Nightmare established it, Scream popularized it. Other films like One Cut of the Dead and The Cabin in the Woods taken it to new levels, basically,
Yeah.
But the ground floor was New Nightmare, and it's a slasher that turns well-worn tropes into brand new tricks. Um,
Mm,
there's a whole lot of good-natured thrills, but New Nightmare is largely, I feel, an auteur being very angry at what his franchise has become.
yeah.
In explaining the concept behind the plot, that there exists this ancient evil entity that can only be stopped by a story powerful enough to contain it, like a Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven kind of openly discusses the fact that his own creation, right, has been stuffed into this glossy corporate box until it's suffocated, with filmmakers that have taken over the mantle and really not lived up or not
Yeah.
honored the first film's legacy. The quote was, the problem comes when the story dies, as Craven, starring as Wes Craven, tells Langenkamp in the film,
Yeah.
and that can happen a lot of ways. It can get too familiar to people, or somebody waters it down to make it an easier sell, or maybe it's just so upsetting that society has banned it outright.
Yeah.
But Craven doesn't point fingers without also taking a deep look at himself.
Hmm.
New Nightmare is essentially the filmmaker's dissection of his own work, putting the horror genre under a microscope and questioning the effect its blood, guts, and gore have on the world. Throughout the movie, young Dylan, the son of Nancy, Heather Langenkamp,
Yeah.
who plays Nancy, is compulsively drawn to screens playing the original Nightmare on Elm Street, as he falls further into Freddy's real life spell, creating an image of horror movies quite literally warping a malleable child's mind.
Hmm.
This is of course paired with the fact that a horror movie icon is actually trying to escape into reality, to murder him. Craven puts the idea right into the dialogue, of the hyper judgmental Dr. Hefner, who tells Langenkamp, I'm convinced these films can tip an unstable child over the edge. So there's a lot of self-reflection here about what his films have made and what society thinks of them and
Yeah.
its effect on society. I think, but more than just poking outwards, the poking inwards makes it good as well.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I think there's so many great lines in the film,
Yeah.
right? That on first pass for people who, I think on first pass for people who watched it when it was released in 1994, they
Hmm.
might not have understood what it meant,
Yeah. Yeah.
because again, first time meta horror, right?
Yeah.
And those are gold, I think to have those lines, like for Wes Craven to put those lines in as a sort of like self-reflexive look at himself and what he has done and what he has become, right? It is it's so good. Like, how do
Hmm.
you get to that point, right, in your career, whereby you've done something with your art, right? And it's been 10 years, and you're just like, you know what? I need to stop this and do something different, and look at it in its entirety, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then like see where we go from here. Like I think it's such a rare opportunity for a creator like Craven, to have a career that allows that,
Mm-hmm.
and it's brilliant in so many ways because of that.
To an extent, Craven also wrote the film for Heather Langenkamp, who plays Nancy, right?
Yeah.
Um, she herself, in real life, felt boxed in by the Scream Queen title of Nightmare on Elm Street,
Hmm.
and this is just a meta way to express the actress's frustration at
Yeah.
being Nancy, so it wasn't just reflexive of his own writing, but also of what it did for to typecast actresses like Heather Langenkamp,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think like Craven had apparently Craven had a tough time getting Heather Langenkamp back on board to this film until he described what the premise was. Like
Yeah.
she didn't want to be just like, oh, Nancy 10 years later. She wanted it to be. He explained to her that this was different. This was gonna examine what it did to my career and what it did to your career and what it did to and what the horror genre has become in general. And I think that's what made Wes Craven's New Nightmare such a special thing.
Hmm.
Some people don't even consider the film part of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise because it really isn't. Like, it's a film about Nightmare on Elm Street. It's not a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
And without Nightmare on Elm Street, which and the New Nightmare, which created the groundwork, which got Wes Craven's brain kind of percolating on the idea of meta horror, right?
Yeah.
Without it, like 2 years later, Scream wouldn't have happened. And I think Scream, as great as New Nightmare was, Scream was the real culmination of what he had in mind with New Nightmare. Like he New Nightmare wasn't a perfect film. There were a lot of flaws.
Hmm.
Wes Craven really polished it all up. Took away the bad, emphasized the good, what works and what doesn't in this type of new genre, what meta horror is, and then made Scream. And Scream, unlike all the other films on our list here,
Yeah.
was kind of an icon. It was a seminal film that changed horror filmmaking like for real, because it was so popular. You haven't seen Scream in maybe 2 decades or a decade and a half kind of thing, right? And,
Yeah.
and neither have I, to be honest. I caught bits and pieces of it on Channel 5 back in the day, enough to know what Scream was about.
Yeah.
And enough to know all the iconic moments in Scream. I had seen of it in out of context, but I've never watched the movie front to back till recently, and I did. And I was really surprised by how good of a film it is,
Hmm.
actually.
Hmm.
I think Scream really breaks down the slasher genre specifically, in very smart and inventive ways. It has a dynamite cast. You had Drew Barrymore in the opening scene when at the time when Drew Barrymore was nobody.
Yeah.
You had Courtney Cox, you got David Arquette, a ton of great actors in there, and yeah. So I mean, what do you think of Scream upon watching it? Now that you're an adult, you already know what it is, and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I was really young when Scream came out, right, in
Mm,
'96. Obviously not old enough to be watching any of that. I do remember very, very clearly that a friend happened to get a hold of the VCD of Scream.
yeah.
About a year later, I think yeah, it was probably pirated or something like that. And a whole bunch of us went to watch it just because we had heard so much about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think from there, that particular disc seemed to travel around, circle,
Right. Right. Right.
unfortunately, as the teens of the time. But I don't think at that point in time, when I first watched it,
Mm-hmm.
I understood how good it was,
Yep.
or I understood why so many people were drawn to it and were talking about it.
I don't think we had the vocabulary because our knowledge of horror filmmaking and slasher movies was quite limited, like being
Yeah,
in primary school,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
we
But
we don't really know what is unpacking, lah.
yeah, but at
Yeah.
the point in time, from what I
Yeah.
remember, or even like sometimes Scream comes up casually in conversations when you're talking about horror, right?
Yep.
As you do. I don't think the audience at that point in time understood why they were drawn to Scream
Mm-hmm.
in a way that we can understand it now, right?
Mm.
And upon rewatching this recently again,
Yeah.
it is really quite it. I remembered it differently. I
Mm-hmm.
think. I think after so many years and like kind of like watching the sequels as I grew older and never quite revisiting Scream in
Mm.
and of itself because I've already watched Scream, right? I want to see what happens next in two, in three, and so on and so forth, right?
Yep.
And then having all of that parodied to death in Scary Movie and
Yeah.
all the subsequent Scary Movies, right? I think my memory of what Scream was entirely diluted
Mm.
by what cultural phenomenon it became, right? And
Yeah.
the consequences of that. Um, so it was kind of like a breath of fresh air to just kind of like sit down and look at Scream with more objective eyes.
Yeah.
And it is really good. It really is very good. Again, not a perfect movie,
Yeah.
but definitely like you can definitely see. So I watched New Nightmare, and then I watched Scream almost immediately after,
Mm.
just to kind of like trace where things were, right? Just 2 years before 1994, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where Wes Craven decided to go with Scream, right? And
Yep.
all of the future franchise from there, the
Yeah.
future of the franchise from there is so fascinating, right? Just to be
Mm-hmm.
able to kind of see the decisions that he made. He says like, okay, I had this in New Nightmare. This was good. I think we can continue to work with that, and then like continuing to kind of like move forward with that in Scream and kind of like polish it up a bit so it's a bit tighter.
Mm-hmm.
Like the motivations there are a bit more understandable. The tropes that you're playing on in this particular section, people already know the trope. You don't have to explain it again. Let's just move on with that and see where we
Mm.
can bring it to its logical conclusion. Like all those strings was so fascinating to trace,
Yeah.
throughout all that. And at the end of the day, like it doesn't age well in terms of like the fidelity of it or all of that.
Uh-huh.
And I think like in comparison to the kind of art horror that we have today,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't quite match up in terms of like the beauty of it and the cinematography of it. But damn, it's still a really enjoyable movie, I have to say.
It is. It is. One of the most iconic scenes in the film is, of course, one of the characters standing in front of Halloween. They were all watching Halloween at a house party and explaining the rules of horror,
Yeah.
what you can and we cannot do. And Scream is essentially that. It's explaining to you the rules of horror, what can be subverted, what can be celebrated, and it's such a great look at least the nascence or the adolescence of meta horror lah.
Yeah.
This was meta horror. If New Nightmare was meta horror at its infancy, this was meta horror in its teenage years, before it
Mm.
really, like it was starting to find itself. It was starting to really come into its own. Cabin in the Woods was, of course, in the adult years. It already knew what it was.
Yeah.
And this was such a great way to expose 90s audiences, which, I mean, no diss to the people in the 90s lah. I was in the 90s lah, but we just weren't that into meta stuff lah, because we just weren't. I was too young to have a vocabulary for what they were talking about here, what they were unpacking and deconstructing and dissecting here.
Yeah.
So I didn't quite understand horror. So I took horror at face value. I took Scream at face value. I took it as a slasher film.
Hmm. Hmm.
When I first watched it. Only recently did I take Scream as what it was intended lah,
Yeah.
as a meta horror film. And it's so good. Even the twist at the end still works. Finding out who the killers were and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
It still really works. The performances are good. Drew Barrymore in the opening scene, Courtney Cox at that point was still in his first 2 seasons of Friends, wasn't really that big yet. Rose McGowan is in it.
Hmm.
Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich, Henry Winkler. Most recently he was in Barry, but he's had a long career.
Hmm.
Jamie Kennedy. Fantastic cast, great premise. Wes Craven at this point in time really pushed meta horror uh, light years forward in just 2 years. With
Yeah.
with New Nightmare and Scream.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Man, yeah, I didn't quite realize like why Scream was considered the horror masterpiece that it is. And I think now I do lah. And I think the only reason I didn't come to that conclusion sooner was because when I watched it, we were both just way too young.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I was kind of thinking, right, is that like I do feel that um okay, outside of being a seminal meta horror movie that we can now look back and say that yes, Scream was important
Yeah.
for where we get our horror today. Uh, I often wonder, is it because we didn't? a lot of the time, like pop culture didn't recognize it as meta horror, and Scream
Mm.
eventually became a parody of itself. That spawned all the very, very lackluster horror that we got in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that a large part of it is the misunderstanding of Scream. Scream was attempting to do what Cabin in the Woods successfully did, revitalize horrors. Scream was trying to be that movie. It was like, enough with the tropes,
Yeah,
enough with the we know all the cliches, like, we're spelling it out for you
yeah,
in this film, in the Scream. We're telling you what the rules are, what can be broken, what cannot be broken, why are these stupid people investigating loud noises in the basement alone, that kind of thing. It's telling you that stop doing this. This is the ultimate, this is the endpoint. We can't grow the genre if we keep doing these things, like,
yeah.
but then because Scream was so successful, right?
Hmm.
Once again, like Wes Craven with Nightmare on Elm Street, it got chewed up by the corporate machinery. It kept making sequels that betrayed the fundamental values of the first film.
Yeah,
Its sequels was straight slasher horrors, without any of the really. I mean, yeah, sure, it winked to horror movies here and there, but it wasn't meta horror in the same way that Scream One was meta horror.
yeah,
The Scream franchise became what Scream was poking fun at, and I think that's sad lah
yeah,
for the writers and creators of the first Scream to find the big studio system, chewing it up and then shitting out like a diluted version of Scream. Not only a diluted version of Scream, like versions of Scream that outwardly betrays the fundamental values of the first film now, and to the point where Scary Movie had to parody what was essentially a parody in itself,
yeah.
Scream.
Exactly.
So it really spoke to me that people misunderstood what Scream was at the day, lah. And I was a child. A lot of people who were making this Scream 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and Scary Movie, those were adults.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like they should have understood what Scream was.
Yeah, and they didn't. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, like, it's been so fascinating to
Yeah,
revisit these two particular works, right?
yeah,
In recency, with perspective,
mm,
with the gift of hindsight, and like the long kind of history of all the movies that have come since then.
yep,
Uh, yeah, it is. I did not expect. Like, I sat down and said, okay, cool, I'm gonna watch Scream, right?
yeah,
Uh, and in my head, I was just like, yeah, I'm just gonna watch Scream. Like, I didn't make a big deal about it, but by the time I was done with the movie, I had a totally different understanding of where it stood.
mm,
In both kind of like my personal, like, understanding of the movie, and when I first watched it as a teen.
mm-hmm,
Uh, and yeah, so if you have not watched Scream
mm-hmm,
anytime recently, or if you have not watched Scream at all, which is actually not as uncommon as I think it is,
mm.
um, please
For
give it a
Gen
try.
Z, like maybe,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, please give it a watch, right? Because, like, it's very sad what it became, but it is very important what it is, right?
yeah.
And yeah, we'll highly, highly recommend that.
Yeah, man. I think a lot of Gen Z people may not be familiar with Scream, considering it is in the early 90s,
Mm,
or mid 90s for Scream. But millennials and Gen Xers are very familiar with Scream, and I will maybe encourage you to rewatch Scream, and maybe you'll get a different experience out of it. With the benefit of hindsight, with more knowledge of what horror is. I think the problem with Scream, to be honest, right, is that I always say this. Like, for example, take Hereditary, right?
yeah,
Hereditary works, and Midsommar and all the art horror films, they work on an intellectual level, right?
yeah,
Like what they work on an intellectual level, but they also work on a visceral, take it at face value level. You
yeah,
have to work on both levels. You have to work as a straight film, and you have to work as a meta intellectual film. The problem with Scream, right, is it works too well at face value.
yeah, yeah,
Like if you want to not dig deep into what it's trying to dissect, right, you can take Scream as at face value as a slasher film, and as actually a good example of what a good slasher film is.
hmm, yep,
You know, and it allows you to ignore or disregard all the things it's saying about the slasher genre.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
and it's a problem when you have that choice, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't think back in the day as a teen, especially, I was looking to, be like, oh wow, I want my brain tickled by some meta horror,
yeah,
right? And I think largely for the movie going audience at the time as well, right? Like, there was no need to, because one part of it already presented such a great movie.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
it's an interesting question how it's possible to strike a balance like that, right? To make sure that you deliver on both ends without compromising the other.
Correct. Yeah. I think Hereditary did it well because people who did not want to dissect the deeper themes of mental illness,
Mm,
generational trauma,
yeah.
gaslighting, things like that, right? If they didn't want to focus on that aspects of Hereditary, they could just take Hereditary as just a really great supernatural horror movie, and it
Mm-hmm.
works. It works straight.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I think that's also to the detriment of Hereditary that it wasn't taken seriously because you can take it straight, so people choose to take it straight.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. So I mean, like, just to kind of extend on that, do you think we've gotten a movie in the last couple of years
Yeah.
where you can't take it straight, right? Like, even if you wanted to, as good as the surface level stuff is, like, you can't just take it straight.
Get Out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
You can't take. I mean, Get Out came on the heels of, keep in mind, the first Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
Eric Garner and all that. In case you guys have forgotten, post George Floyd, this thing has been going on for a long time,
Mm-hmm,
man.
mm-hmm.
And in that atmosphere, right, you can't watch Get Out without thinking about what it means.
Yeah.
You have like society was at a point of a reckoning, like especially white people, considering what complicity they have in this.
Yeah.
And you can't watch Get Out without considering the underlying themes of it lah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Get Out works as a straight horror film. It definitely does. Jordan Peele is that good. But on a deeper level, people were thinking about Get Out on a much deeper level. And I think Get Out was one of the first real art house films that really like broke the door open. Like the
Yeah.
dam suddenly opened right
Yep,
after
yep,
that.
for sure, for sure. Like, I think you can definitely see that from Get Out onwards, it was just, I mean, like everything A24 has been doing, for example, right?
Yeah,
And everything Jordan Peele is doing, Hereditary, and so on and so forth. Like, it's very clear,
yeah,
at that as a marker whereby it spoke to the zeitgeist. It was an amazing film in and of itself, but it spoke to the zeitgeist, right? It spoke to the moment,
yeah,
and it was something that audiences couldn't ignore. Yeah,
yeah,
because of its
yeah.
context. Agree. I totally agree.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, on the flip side, also, like I think like something like Midsommar works well as an intellectual exercise, but not so much as a visceral horror film.
Mm,
I think like if for those who have seen Midsommar, like I love the film, but
yeah,
the thing is, I love to think about the film.
yeah. I
You know?
haven't rewatched it.
Yeah.
Just because I don't think there's much to rewatch, but it comes up in discussions a lot. It comes
Mm.
up in talking about horror a lot. I totally get where you're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like I like to talk about it. I like to think about it. I like to discuss its themes, but I don't actually know whether it works as a straight film.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, the problem is like kind of like talking about these things.
Yeah.
Is that we can't. There's no real separation. Like, we separate it in our minds, but there's no real separation from that. But I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
think I would rewatch Midsommar unless it was to introduce someone to it, right?
Mm.
And I'm not really sure if it's that. Like, it works so much better in my head than
Yeah.
I think the actual experience of sitting there in the cinema to watch it.
Yeah, I mean that's not to take away from the technical genius of Ari Aster or the
Yeah,
amazing
yeah,
performance of Florence Pugh.
hmm
I'm just saying that it works better on one level than on the other, lah.
yeah, for sure.
Uh, yeah, yeah, definitely, man. Yeah, so I'm glad that we took some time out this Halloween season, the spooky season, to talk about horror tropes and horror cliches. And I thought the best way to do that was with these type of movies, rather than just talking about it, like an essay.
hmm
Let's break down films that have already broken these things down for
Yeah,
us.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's been
yeah,
so fun. It's been so incredibly fun exploring these things. I think,
hmm
like, um, it's been interesting just to see this particular, just a slate of movies that are being made available for people to watch during this spooky season, right?
hmm
And like being able to watch these four movies as just part of uh, a canon that has been established before. It's been super interesting to kind of like revisit where all these things have been in the past,
yeah,
and what they mean to a lot of people now,
hmm
and to the movies now. And I mean, I just finished like Blind Manor, and I'm just like, okay,
mm.
it's so good, but you can't watch Blind Manor without appreciating. I mean, you can watch Blind Manor without appreciating, but like, I really appreciated these four particular movies more.
hmm
In conjunction with watching like Blind Manor and Haunting Hill House.
Oh, definitely,
Yeah.
man. Yeah. These three films made by, to me, like the three best people at subverting genre filmmaking. Joss Whedon has a long history of that. Shinichiro Ueda, clearly that's what he's trying to do with all sorts of genres, not just horror.
Yeah.
And Wes Craven, towards the end of his horror career, started looking back at what worked, what didn't, what can we do with the genre in the future. Very interesting, different takes on what horror has been and what it will become.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to check all these films out, they're available on VOD. You highly recommend it. Some of them are, Cabin in the Woods, for example, is also available on Netflix.
Yep.
So do check it out. We'll be back for genre equality next week. Similarly, in genre equality, there is a lot of horror to be talking about. Unlike the four horror films that we talked about here, 99% of the horror films and TV shows released, Blind Manor is the exception, released this October, are terrible.
Yeah.
Truly, truly, truly terrible. Like one step forward, 10 steps back.
Oh my god.
It's very sad that I went through like this slew of like 20 different TV shows and horror films. Couldn't find a single, with the exception of Blind Manor once again. Couldn't
Yeah.
find a single one that was even like worth my time. Like 5 out of 10, kind of thing. It's so
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah.
It's so sad. People are just releasing garbage these days just because it's the season lah. It's the
Hmm.
corporate machinery once again. Like oh, Amazon needs a horror film, Netflix needs a horror film, Hulu needs a horror film, and all of them happen to be anthologies because anthologies are cool now. It's it's so frustrating. I was just very frustrated because like this particular genre took up more of my time than usual,
Yeah.
and like most of it was such garbage lah. Like I couldn't. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I'll
I'm
I'll
so
get into.
sorry, man.
It's okay. Like I thought, Halloween season, I should probably go watch all these horror offerings, but man,
Yeah.
they suck lah. But I'll be getting into them individually on the next genre equality if you wanna listen to that.
Yeah.
But on a brighter note, our main topics are Lovecraft Country,
Hmm.
which ended its season this week actually,
Yep.
with its finale, Haunting of Bly Manor, which is very good as well, and the return of Genndy Tatowski's Primal. You may recall we talked about his previous show, Samurai Jack, on this show,
Yeah.
and also we've reviewed Primal season one. This is the last 5 episodes of season one, and we'll be talking about it as well. Primal continues to be such a wordless, such a great dialogue-free animated series.
Yeah.
Loved it. So those are our three main topics, and we'll talk about a bunch more elsewhere after that. Till then, this has been Hit Zero.
This is Isa.
Yep, and catch us next week for Genre Equality. Goodbye, guys.
Ciao.